Hi, everybody. Welcome to Wellness Wednesdays for Men's Health. All throughout June, we're doing these Wednesday activities. We're also doing other workshops as well all month, and you'll see these on our YouTube channel for further information to be able to review this information as well. I'm really interested in highlighting a lot of our campus services and community members, and I'm so excited that we're able to have Dr. Travers join us today to share about what Dr. Travers does on campus and all the support and resources that the LGBT Resource Center offers. So that being said, I'd love you, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and introduce yourself and give us sort of an introduction of those general things.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Again, my name is Sean Travers. I'm a campus diversity officer here at UC San Diego, and I direct UC San Diego's LGBT Resource Center, serving the LGBTQI plus campus community here. And I've been doing this work for about 20 years, and it is always important to be thinking about how many communities access issues related to health. And so when I think about our LGBTQI plus community who identify as men, I'm thinking about our trans men, our non-binary men, our intersex men, our gay, bisexual, and queer men, all who are masculine of center, all of the folks that are experiencing life through a lens of maleness, of being a man, and of masculinity. And so that kind of deeply inclusive way that we need to consider health and what it means for our health. So I'm excited for the conversation today, Christopher, and excited that you invited me to do this.
Awesome, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I actually really enjoy a lot of what you said there. And the term deeply inclusive, I think, really speaks to the heart of where I see men's health being at UCSD. My job title is men's health, right? So I definitely have a focus in a certain area, but that deeply inclusive mindset is exactly where I'm at with this. So I want these to be inclusive, not exclusive conversations 100% of the time. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Something I'd like to start maybe talking about with regards to men's health, as far as LGBTQAI plus community health, I'm kind of moving in lots of different directions there. One big thing that we're seeing a lot, especially coming off of a year and a half of COVID, are issues around stress, anxiety, mental health, emotional well-being. A lot of these issues are really at the forefront of our minds right now. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind sharing your experience, as well as just anecdotally what that has looked like with you and students that you serve as well. But as sort of an introduction to that topic, would you mind sharing a little bit of why mental health is important to you and sort of why you think it's important for students that your resource center serves?
Mental health is part of this holistic way that we approach health in general. There's a lot of ways that we can think about health, and certainly mental health is one window into that. Our physical health, our sexual health, our spiritual health, all of those things are deeply connected and interconnected. So when I think about mental health, I also am thinking about those other elements, knowing that that lens, the mental health lens, is really important. In our community in particular, the LGBTQI plus community, we have a deep history of being medicalized. That very often we were thought of as a sick community, that we could be diagnosed with a mental health issue just for being who we are. And that history is still part of our legacy, still part of what will always be a part of who we are as a people, as a community, that to this day, there are folks who, because of simply existing in the world, have been medicalized, have been told that they are sick, will be sick, have some level of mental illness. And how we address that from a perspective of mental health, how we think about that from the perspective of those that are positioned to provide us health care. And to the degree that we can trust those that are positioned to provide us health care, given the deep legacies of being mistreated by a system that wasn't built for us, that didn't think about us as it was thinking about health, and in particular, mental health. That's not to say there are not many, many very good and skilled providers that serve the LGBTQI plus community. But the reality that there may be some hesitancy among our community, and in particular among men, trans men, intersex men, non-binary men, masculine of-center people, some real hesitancy in seeking out mental health care because of, one, how masculinity functions, right? How masculinity functions, we already have a barrier to asking for help. And in particular around things related to our mental health, which may be connected to our emotions and feelings, right? So we know that that's the barrier. Layer that with the LGBTQI plus experience and the history of exclusion, or if we are included, we are only included in terms of having some level of disease and illness, then I think, oh my gosh, how do we socialize and normalize health, mental health, what healthy is and feels like and is experienced by men in the LGBTQI plus community? I think it is a community conversation that needs to continue to be ongoing around creating accessibility. And how does that work? I mean, part of that is this conversation today. At the LGBT Resource Center at UC San Diego, we serve our students, undergraduate and graduate students. We serve our staff. We serve our faculty. We are trying to create a sense of community. That's certainly our mission, in a word, is to create community. And we do that through sometimes having really important conversations that center social justice, that center intersectionality. So when I talk about men, I'm talking about Black men. I'm talking about Latinx non-binary men. I'm talking about Pacific Islander trans men. I'm talking about cisgender men who are Native American. I'm talking about two-spirit people who are Asian American. I'm talking about the diaspora of those who are currently living in the US from many different places. I'm talking about the indigenous people that are part of our community that are still here, that have survived what colonization did to this country. So a deeply intersectional way of thinking about how we include people at the LGBT Resource Center, and then how we provide access to conversations around health and mental health, and having that through a lens of men and masculinity. I think that's deeply vital, is to just hold some space for those conversations, because we know we are a resilient community. How do we know that? We are here. And many of us are here and healthy, right? That we have, without necessarily the advantages of an easy route to mental health care, or a route that felt inclusive, we still sought out what we need. We still tried to get what we needed, and we got it to the degree that we are surviving UC San Diego. We're surviving our homes that we are in. We are surviving the community and cultures that we are navigating. And so I think that resilience and that strength is important to honor, knowing that that resilience and strength is coupled with a lot of vulnerability and a lot of areas where, gosh, we need help and continue to need help and may need long-term assistance to be well, for wellness and mental wellness to be part of our conversation and part of the journey of our community. That's simply something we do and we talk about. And so I'm really glad, Christopher, you invited me into this conversation today, because that's how I kind of frame the approach to it in terms of what we need to talk about and what we need to think about.
Thank you so much for sort of anchoring this whole conversation in a historical and social context. I think that's so vital to have sort of like jumping off point moving forward. And also bringing up this holistic view of health, this whole version of being. I think that's something that is so vital that we often try to put into little silos and little boxes in our life. Or this is for this outcome, but really they all play together. And something that we do very much here is we take that very intersectional, very holistic lens of health and well-being specifically, of looking at how does this impact this? How does this impact this? And sort of bringing all these different areas together to create programs and educational materials that, while they may have a focus area, they do bring in these other dimensions of well-being and how they sort of work together. So I think that's really powerful. I think another aspect that you brought up I would love to discuss a little bit more if you're open to this, would be the idea of what masculinity is and what that could be, and what it, like, when I say masculinity, I'm including femininity in that sort of conversation, right? But when we're looking, like you say, like you put it at, through a lens of masculinity, what does that mean? And on that same note, how does masculinity impact the college experience for someone coming into college maybe for the first time?
Yeah. It's a great question. One of the ways we can think about masculinity is through the idea of it is a socialized process. That when we are born, we are this infant that takes incredible amounts of care. And those folks that love us and care about us provide us that care, that the human beings are particularly a vulnerable species, that some species, they're born and they're walking and they're eating on their own within hours of birth. We are arguably a couple decades old when we come into full maturity in order to care for ourselves. Now, some people through circumstance are taking care of themselves at very young ages, but in the best circumstances, we have caregivers that are providing us the tools to navigate the world we're born into. And those caregivers, who often love us and care about us, teach us what masculinity is. They teach us what femininity is. They often teach those things as contrasting, although I would argue they're not. And we learn these things very early on. In fact, when a child is born, one of the first questions people often ask is a boy or a girl? And it's not because they're so interested in genitalia or potential hormone levels in the future or chromosomes or gonads. They're not. They are interested in concepts of masculinity and femininity as they relate to what pronouns should be used to refer to an infant in third person. And oddly enough, what colors they might want that child to be dressed in as an infant, right? Like that deeply ingrained are these concepts of masculinity. I'm going to decorate this child's room in this way with iconography of masculinity. So it's deeply socialized from infancy. And even those of us who are well versed in concepts of gender expression and how it plays out, still have these deep socializations that play out in ways that we cannot predict. In raising our own children, we might really strive to be deeply inclusive, but the messages are not just from caregivers. Very, very quickly, those secondary caregivers, sometimes those are grandparents, sometimes those are aunties and uncles, tias and tios, all of those folks. But then there's also the school systems. There are religious organizations, the ever-present media, whatever ways you consume that, give you all these messages. And so masculinity ends up being this thing that you could not question, right? You could not question, or you can deeply interrogate it. But in particular, as LGBTQIA+ people, we're often thinking about it. We're thinking about it from a from a very kind of like exploratory lens, gender nonconformity is often one of the markers of being part of our community. That people often, if they want to mark our community, they will look to it through gender nonconformity. That applies to our LGBTQ plus community. So thinking about sexual orientation, romantic attraction, right? Like that kind of spectrum of how our community pulls it together, but also our trans and our non-binary and our intersex community, that kind of gender identity plays, that it is nonconformity. And nonconformity is often to masculinity or femininity, right? It's to these socialized roles of what it means to be in this society. Again, not so often about parts. It's not about parts. It's not about pieces. It's not about gonads. It's about the social performance of masculinity. And we start to question that, or it's questioned for us in young childhood. It may be part of our journey in terms of our trans and non-binary identity. It may be part of our journey in our LGBT identity. And that questioning can create all kinds of very interesting things, very, very interesting things. I was reading just this week this wonderful kind of exploration of these deep, deep images of masculinity, of hypermasculinity, that came out of some queer men, some gay men, in particular Tom of Finland, who was late 60s, early 70s. That was also kind of taken on by Robert Mapplethorpe, that created these really deep and powerful images of sex and sexuality and masculinity that were both interrogating it, but also creating it in an iconic kind of way, born out of the 1940s and 50s glamour of Hollywood that became something that's very queer, right? That has now evolved into these bizarre, sometimes, expressions of hypermasculinity within the LGBTQI plus community to somehow prove either being a part of or not being a part of it, right? It's very, very confusing. You know, the expectations for trans men to perform masculinity, in some ways, the expectations for gay men to perform masculinity. It's, you know, and then how queerness then plays out in that and what that means. And so, you know, I think of the masculinity often as a trap I fall into, but also a comforting place because it was something I was socialized to be. So there's a comfort there, but also too often deeply connected to misogyny and then connected to trans misogyny, and then how that separates me from my community. When I don't interrogate my own socialization, when I don't critique how I am being in the world, but also knowing I still want to be authentically me, which for me means I wear a lot of blue, right? Because I actually like blue and I have blue eyes. And so, you know, this idea that boys wear blue, but yeah, but Sean wears blue, not because he's a boy, but because Sean really likes the color blue, but being able to hold both of those things at the same time, right? To be able to say, I can do both of those things. I can be exactly who I am in the world to the degree that I am masculine, and I can be exactly who I am in the world to the degree that I'm feminine. And be a full, whole, healthy, mentally healthy person as I'm exploring gender, as I'm doing gender, as I'm doing my own gender expression, and letting it evolve with my queerness and who I am. So I think it all is deeply tied. And I think in particular, people that understand themselves to have a men's experience, right? Or have a history of a men's experience, or find themselves on a masculine expression, on the masculine continuum, I lost my word, masculine continuum, to really explore it, to explore what it means, how it can be a trap, how it can be a blessing, and how it can relate to our own heads and hearts in terms of our mental health.
And I think something you brought up that as soon as you said it, it sort of like rang, so it resonated in my ear so well, was just being who you are in the world, like allowing that to manifest really from that deep introspective place of figuring out what that is in the first place and allowing that to then be who you are, at least from the view of others, like outwardly and inwardly, right? on that same note, I also want to pay tribute to this as Pride Month as well. So looking at how being your most authentic self and being prideful and being open and strong about that in the real world, in that sense at least, what does, or what are ways that pride can look from a masculinity's perspective, but in a very intersectional, very wide perspective? What does pride look like in these communities when we're talking about masculinity specifically and how that plays into it? And part of this, bringing this up, is because we also look at things like healthy relationships and what that looks like, and the sort of the old saying about being with someone, being with yourself before you're with someone else, sort of thing, and figuring out what that feels like. And yes, other people can be there to help with that discovery process, absolutely, but how that plays into our interpersonal relationships even, and being prideful of all of that. So I'd love to hear a little bit more around any of those topics, really.
No, I appreciate that. Pride as protest. Pride as protest. Thinking even before we had the Stonewall riots, the folks that were protesting what they had been taught in terms of how to keep their place. The Compton cafeteria riots, the early work of the Belida Society, the community organizing around Black and Brown communities that were part of our community to try and hold space and take space. That pride, if we think of, and it's a beautiful alliterative concept of linking pride and protest together in relation to masculinity, right? So how can I protest the way that I've been socialized to be masculine and take pride in my masculinity at the same time? Because pride as a season, right? As June is Pride Month, San Diego honors Pride in July. You know, San Diego always does things a little bit different, which I love. You know, we do our Pride stuff in July. It's a season where we can really protest what we've been taught. Because I think too often we've been taught to exclude. We've been taught to other. We've been taught to say, these are my people, because if I say these are my people, those aren't my people. You know, if pride can be inclusive, if masculinity can be inclusive, if we can remember that there are men who have vaginas, if we can remember that there are men who have an experience of being something that wasn't socialized as male and masculine, even though that person may have known it. If we can remember that masculinity can be full of pinks and lavenders and caring and loving, that queering of masculinity is fundamentally what pride is about. It is about being in community with others and protesting the things that trap us from being authentically who we are, fully who we are, completely who we are, and taking those moments to do that in all of their big affrontive glory. One of the reasons I adore the flag that's behind me on the screen is it's this more inclusive flag than we've ever seen. And I think many pride organizations have adopted this flag as a way of protesting what we've been socialized in terms of what it means to be part of our community. And I think some men have really struggled with that. I think masculinity has struggled with that, of being inclusive. I've heard too many folks, you know, I'm connected to many bear communities, and too many folks in the bear community saying, yeah, and it feels awful white very often. And often it feels pretty misogynistic. And being able to, during Pride season in particular, protest that through action, through behavior, through invitation to others to be involved in bear activities, you know, whatever that means. That holding community is important. Like, I always want there to be a bear community, but a deeply inclusive bear community. that embraces all of the LGBTQI plus community, knowing that whatever it means to be a bear can evolve to include all of us in some really important ways. And so I particularly think that Pride's a time to think about that, but always linking it to protest, and protest what we've been taught about masculinity, to embrace the things that we know are deeply connected to other ways of experiencing gender, of doing gender, of being a gendered person.
And the idea of the protest starting here first, like protest what you think you know, and protest what you think these expectations are and why they're the way they are. And then how do you employ that in what you're doing in the world? I think starting internal is such an important takeaway from what you just said, for me, myself at least. Thinking a little bit about how masculinity is and gender is just one frame of reference when talking about inclusion. We also can talk on religious inclusion or racial ethnic inclusion, or all these different, so many different things we can talk about, which all need to be discussed. What is maybe a tip you could provide someone listening to this around finding ways to be inclusive, regardless of what that lens is, but with that curiosity of picking up the lens in the first place of, okay, I want to be inclusive for a lot of different things. How could I be more inclusive to my LGBT fratmate? How can I be more LGBT inclusive towards my coworker or classmate? Those sorts of things on sort of a technique or a skill maybe that someone could try in their own life to make themselves more inclusive, specifically in this sort of.
It's a great question. So if you're watching this right now, I'd like you to look at who you see on the screen. And I'd like you to think about what identities you see represented if you are tuning into this and you're looking. My truth is I'm tall, I'm white, I'm cisgender, I'm male. I identify as bi and queer and pan and fluid and sometimes gay if I'm being super lazy about it and I don't want to explain what any of those other terms mean. But for me, the trick that I do is I'm often, like even right now in this moment, I'm critiquing what I see in terms of the similarities of who's talking in conversation today, what that means for inclusion, why there aren't other voices here that are being heard that don't look like me or sound like me or have my lived experience. Knowing and honoring, Christopher, that you invited me to hear that it was primarily going to be a conversation between me and you, and there's only two big identities in the room and it's me and you. So like, how inclusive can you be with two people? Well, you could be more inclusive because it wouldn't be me, but you wanted the director of the LGBT Resource Center to be here, and that's only one me, and this is what I bring, right? So I have to honor that too. Like, this is all I can bring to the conversation in terms of identity, is what I have to bring. And that's valuable and important and should be deeply critiqued in terms of what that means for inclusion. A tip is to look around the room and see who you see. And if who you see in the room looks an awful lot like you, sounds an awful lot like you, then that's the moment to pause and ask, gosh, what is my role in changing how this looks to be more inclusive? What do I need to do with those in the room to get them on board that, gosh, this needs to change, right? So working with people that look like me to have hard conversations around race, to have hard conversations around gender, to have hard conversations around religion and culture. Because that's the hard work, talking to people that look like me. And then in those conversations, deeply being inclusive of people to draw folks in, if they want to be part of that, to say we need to be more inclusive. That it is not the work of those who are not part of are not here to demand their way in, even though they should be demanding their way in, but it's part of our work to figure out how we get people in to have that inclusive conversation. It's not an easy answer, but the first thing to do is just be critical. deeply critical about what you see and who's in the room, and then to ask others in the room if they're seeing the same thing, and to think about how we change the nature of what this room looks like, the proverbial room, I should say, the metaphorical room, of in this LGBTQIA plus acronym, when I gather with one letter of that acronym, who do I see? Who do I not see? What are the colors that I see? What are the genders? What are the abilities that I see? And how do I name that in the moment? Right. Again, that's the takeaway I want folks to see what you see, to be able to name it, and then have a conversation with those that are there about what you see. Hey, it looks like we're all fill in the blank. And I want to be deeply inclusive. And can we talk about that? That'll make people uncomfortable, but that's really important to do because we have to change that. We have to be more inclusive. And so just being conscious of who's in the room. And I don't want to make assumptions about everyone's ethnicity and race, even on the Zoom call today. I don't want to make those assumptions, but I do think that snapshots matter, and what you see matters, because you can't always hear a person's full story. And so visual representation matters, but going deeper matters too, right? If we're talking about mental health and mental wellness, you can't necessarily see my depression and anxiety, right? I have to talk about that for you to know that that's part of my journey, right? For you to know that we are being inclusive around issues of what those diagnoses might mean. But I first have to be willing to take that risk, and I have to be able to bring it into the room. You can't always see some of the diversities that are really important and valuable, in particular things around being neuroatypical or neurotypical. And so I want to name that as well.
Yeah, I think that's just really fantastic. So many amazing points you brought up. And I think we've had a really good opportunity to get some deep dives into some of these wonderful conversations. But to sort of, I guess, and not but, to bring it in a way that might be a little easier to, a little more palatable, might be a better way to say that. Not to oversimplify, but what would be one thing that you want all UCSD students to know, and particularly UCSD men, somewhere across that spectrum?
It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to ask for help. I think lots of folks, when they're socialized around being male, being a man, and masculinity, lose that, or never had it. And if there's one thing I want folks to take away, it's okay to ask for help. That is not weakness. That is strength. That is actually real strength, is to ask for help. And we don't do it enough. I don't do it enough. I still, to this day, struggle with asking for help. It's deeply socialized that somehow doesn't match my masculinity. And I can think that up here, right? I can say that out my mouth. But when the rubber hits the road, the proverbial rubber hits the road, I still find it very difficult to ask for help. Very difficult to ask for help. So I just want to say, actually, probably for myself and to anyone else who's watching or hearing this, it's okay to ask for help. It's an incredibly important thing for men, for folks who are masculine of center, folks that are on the spectrum of masculinity, to be able to do is to ask for help. Because asking for help means you're being in community with at least one other person, or maybe a whole bunch of other person. And at the end of the day, that's what the LGBT Resource Center does, is help build community. And asking for help builds community, because it creates a space of vulnerability. And vulnerability is a great space to build community, because then we can care about each other more deeply. And that's really important.
That's something that I really appreciate you saying, because it's also something that I work a lot on, is around destigmatizing help-seeking behaviors and seeking out for resources, kind of across the board on health, but especially on things like mental and emotional well-being. It's a really a hard challenge to have men seek out those services. There's a huge stigma around mental health. Kind of the knee-jerk reaction is to call it mental illness in the first place. And as soon as we use those phrases like illness or diseases, we've suddenly created this whole identification with those things. And just like going to an annual checkup with a doctor is to make things, see how things are working, see there's like some maintenance needs to be done. The same thing can happen with a therapist or with a nutritionist or whatever other service that is available. And kind of preventing other things from happening down the line as well is so important. And taking that space is courageous. It is strong to do that. An analogy I've used before is like a tall skyscraper. They stand so long and so tall because they move with the wind. They are flexible when the earth quakes. It's not because they don't move and because they have no flexibility. It's because they are adapting to their environments in a designed way. So taking some lessons from that of how do we, if we want to be strong, how do we stay strong? But how do we also allow for that flexibility in who we are with what we do in life with all these different areas? So I really appreciate you calling out that sort of help-seeking behavior and reaching out for resources, not just in a health lens, but also through a social lens, a community lens, and academic lens, whatever else that may be, and finding the supports where you want them. And sort of specifically on that finding support aspect, something I really ask everyone that comes onto these workshops and these talks are, if someone would like to reach out to the Resource Center to actually access those services, more than just a go to this website kind of discussion, but what are a step-by-step, what would that look like? The purpose behind this question is taking out any sort of unknown. So if someone were to call your office, what will they hear? You know, like those sorts of things. Of just sort of what are the unknowns and what's going to happen when someone reaches out to the LGBT Resource Center?
It's a great question, Christopher. First of all, does anyone use the phone anymore? Do people call the center? That's great. I mean, let's assume someone did for some reason pick up their phone for a voice call. Clearly they're over 30 and not necessarily, but when you reach out to our center via the phone, or maybe sending us a message through Facebook Messenger, or maybe Instagram, you know, a DM, any way that you're going to reach out, you're going to be connected to one of the folks that work there, either one of our career staff employees or one of our undergraduate students that work there. And more than anything, they're going to try and figure out, what can I do for you today in terms of getting you connected to community? What we do in a phrase is we build community. And so trying to find out, what community do you need? And how can we help you get there? Now, right now, everything's virtual. So these kind of experiences is what's happening. In the fall, we will open up. Folks will come to the center to really start to do some community organizing, to really start to see each other physically and in person. And in seeing each other, trying to organize around what makes sense for us to do in this moment to continue to protest, because pride is protest, continue to change UC San Diego to be more deeply inclusive. But the step-by-step is just reach out through any kind. You can walk through our doors. In the fall, you'll be able to walk through our doors. You will see someone sitting at a front desk. They will give you a visual and verbal greeting. I'm so glad you're here. Have you been here before? You haven't? Let me tour you through the space, give you a sense of it. Here are the organizations that meet here on a regular basis. Here's the community organizing that's happening right now. Here's some programs and events that could inform how you might want to find community. And if none of that appeals to you, how can we help you create what you want, to create the world that you want to live in at UC San Diego in terms of the LGBTQIA plus community? We want to empower folks to be able to do that. Because often folks don't see themselves when they walk in. They might see me, right? Like might be the person that you interact with, and you might go, you look nothing like me. You are way over 30. You are way over 40, right? And you look nothing like me. But the idea is, how can I get you connected? Not necessarily with someone who's going to be exactly like you. We all have so much uniqueness about us, but help you find the community you want to find. And if you don't see it immediately in the person you're interacting with, helping you get connected to that. And so that's what it looked like, either online or through whatever mediums you want to do, even in person. It's going to look like trying to meet your needs around community activism, community building, and community organizing. Was that concrete enough?
That was perfect. Thank you. And then the last question I have for you, it's actually less of a question. It's just, I'll open up the floor. If there's anything else you'd like to share about what you do, or about anything you'd like viewers or listeners to know about what you do, the services that are offered, or the campus community at large, really it's up to you. And after this, we'll jump into questions after this.
So I'll close it out by mentioning our peer centers that are deeply important to us. That the LGBT Resource Center does not exist in a vacuum of centers, that we're deeply connected to the Black Resource Center, the Women's Center, the Raza Resource Center, the Cross-Cultural Center, the Intertribal Resource Center, and Asian Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, Deji American programs and services. That all of those spaces are LGBT centers, and our space is all of those spaces. That all of those spaces strive. Do they meet it every day? I don't know, but they strive every day to be inclusive of all the identities that people have when they come in those spaces. So when you walk into the Women's Center, you don't have to stop being trans. When you walk into the Black Resource Center, the fact that you are biracial and Latinx is part of your experience. That when you are in the LGBT Resource Center, we honor and know and understand and support your Native American and Indigenous identity, that all those things are intersected. So I just want to shout out to my peer centers that do this good work, around masculinity and men's health as well. And so to also connect with the peer centers that I just named.
Thank you. I think that's a really good call out, and it's good to know that there is a network of support and a network of intersectional support and connected support through all these different areas. So thank you so much for shouting that out. That being said, that's really all we have for you today. So thank you all for joining us. And if you're going to stick around, we'll do some Q&A. But if you're heading off, thank you so much for joining us today.